Have you ever heard the expression, "A house divided against itself cannot stand"? Abraham Lincoln was paraphrasing the Bible when he made that comment in a speech back in 1858. Makes sense. Any math teacher will tell you that when you divide something, you break it apart. The funny thing is, despite Lincoln's words, the government of this country is based on a system that encourages it to become divided. And many people believe that a divided government is better than a unified one. So what do divided government and unified government mean? The President of the United States does not run this country alone. He has to work with members of the U.S. Congress to get things done. Congress is made up of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. If the majority of the members in each House of Congress are in the same political party as the President, that's a unified government. But that doesn't always happen. A Democratic president might have to work with a Republican-controlled Senate, for example. That's known as a divided government. The recent presidential campaign between George W. Bush and John Kerry brought up lots of talk about red states, mainly Republican, and blue states, or Democratic strongholds. Dividing the country like that feels uncomfortable to many people. It's even made some people ask whether divided governments make it impossible to get laws passed in Washington.
And that was the real message that should have gotten out, and it was on this show where the best point of all was made.
Everywhere you go these days, you hear strong opinions. On one side, the conservative messages that are supposed to appeal to people in the red states. And on the other, liberal messages that blue state residents are supposed to believe.
75% of all Americans on the minimum wage, my friends, are teenagers in their first job.
Of course, nothing is really that black and white, or blue and red in this case, despite what radio commentators, newspaper editors, and bloggers might say.
It's important when you want to pass a big law in Congress that some Democrats and some Republicans, a portion of each, ultimately come to some kind of agreement. Congress is about compromise, and if Democrats and Republicans aren't willing to compromise, it's unlikely you'll get big legislation.
Without these compromises, Congress gets gridlocked and nothing gets done. That was the big fear when Democrat Bill Clinton was re-elected as president in 1996. The majority of representatives in Congress were Republicans, led by conservative Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. It didn't look like the two sides would ever agree, but these fears were never realized.
Clinton obtains, in some ways, more legislation in his second term than he does in his first, which is ironic because in the first term there's a moment when Democrats control Congress. But one of the things Clinton does is he starts to compromise more with the Republican Congress in his second term, and the Republicans start to work a little more with Clinton, even though they don't like him very much.
The president also used the presidential veto, the power to reject a bill, and he used it a lot. From 1995 to 2000, he vetoed 35 bills and threatened to veto about 100 more. Republican leaders challenged 11 of the 35, but only managed to override the president once.
The veto was very important for Bill Clinton in trying to kind of calm down Republicans in terms of what their demands were. That was his biggest negotiating tool. The president has the veto, and he used that in the budget wars with the Republicans to force them to move a little bit to the center on the budget, just as they forced President Clinton to move a little bit to the center on their issues. And that was part of how ultimately we reached compromise during that second term.
As important as the presidential veto and compromise are, a divided government also benefits from one other thing: a healthy economy. Traditionally, a divided government works better in times of prosperity, such as during President Clinton's second term. That's because lawmakers have fewer tough decisions to make about cutting programs and spreading limited dollars around. Decisions that tend to split politicians along party lines.
President Clinton found a way to keep things moving when faced with a divided government. But wouldn't it simply have been better to have one unified government? That's what they do in other countries, such as Great Britain. Back when the framers were hammering out a constitution, a house that could be divided seemed like a very good idea because it was a built-in system of checks and balances that prevented any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. So, does that make a unified government a bad thing?
By the middle of Republican George W. Bush's first term as president, Republicans held a majority of seats in both houses of Congress, creating a unified government. Many people worried that this one-party control of the Senate, the House, and the presidency might leave some Americans without a voice in Washington. But in earlier times, people often considered a unified government to be a better government. When Republicans took control of Congress after the elections of 1946, for example, some representatives actually asked Democratic President Harry S. Truman to step down in order to create a unified government.
The Republicans in Congress made things hard for President Truman. They made it hard to pass health care. They made it hard to pass a lot of domestic programs. And in turn, Truman became more vocal and more critical and more aggressive in attacking the Congress. And that's often the situation you get when we have divided government in America.
Unified governments are usually easier on presidents. More of their laws get passed. That's certainly what George W. Bush found in his first term.
President Bush benefited from a unified government. What a unified government allows a president to do is push through legislation quickly and forcefully. And President Bush was able to push through a historic tax cut in 2001, and he had solid support from the Republicans, even though Democrats didn't really agree with what was going on. And when he launched the war against Iraq, it was a lot easier for him to do it because the Republicans were so together on this issue. They stuck together and they worked with the president to push that through. So it helped him move things quickly.
Every nation.
But just because a president's party controls Congress doesn't mean every senator or representative from his party will always agree with him. Just ask the candidates in a presidential primary debate. The president still has to work with members of Congress to forge agreements and build consensus. Our system of government is meant to represent as many different people and opinions as possible. And the best governments are those that build support among both Democrats and Republicans.
So, what do Americans want? A recent national poll found a growing number of Americans, about 1/3, want a divided government. Some say this means that more Americans are worried that our political parties have moved too far to the left and to the right, leaving out the people in the middle. It's good to be true to your core values and beliefs, but at what point does this become a problem? Bickering between political parties can bring down a whole government. President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, took office after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but his lack of interest in punishing ex-Confederate soldiers and his vetoing of a number of bills that would have given increased civil rights to freed slaves angered many Republicans, and ultimately may have led to Johnson's impeachment. Can a House divided ever be stronger than a unified House? It all depends on whether the two sides are willing to reach across the divide. Lots of people tend to think of the President of the United States as being similar to the head of a big corporation, in charge of everything that goes on in this country. But that's not really true. The President is the head of the executive branch of government, and the powers of the President, or executive powers, are laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution. The President's job description, if you want to call it that, includes a role in national security, how the legislature and judicial arm of government work, and the administration of the government. One of the most important roles of the President is Commander-in-Chief of our armed services. He can send troops overseas without declaring war, and he can call the National Guard into federal service. But if he wants to declare war officially, he needs the approval of Congress. The President can recommend legislation to Congress, but he can't write any laws. If he wants to submit a law, he needs to get a member of Congress to do it for him. But even though he can't write laws, he has the power to keep proposals from being made into law with the presidential veto. The President isn't a judge, but he can appoint justices to the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the country, whenever there is a court vacancy during a presidency. These 9 judges are responsible for interpreting federal laws. The President can also grant pardons to people convicted of federal crimes. One controversial executive power the President has is known as executive privilege. Executive privilege is all about information. What kind of information the President and executive branch can keep to themselves for reasons such as protecting national security, and what information the public, including Congress, has a right to know. But nowhere in the Constitution do we actually see the words executive privilege. So what does it really mean?
The President's duties are clearly defined in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Constitution makes it clear that no person, including the President, is above the law. But presidents sometimes argue that not everything they know should be made public, even to members of Congress. That's what happened with President George Washington and the Jay Treaty.
President Washington in 1796 got into a conflict with the House of Representatives. He had recently negotiated a treaty with the British, whereby the British paid Americans for losses during the Revolution and agreed to remove certain troops. And many people were upset with the treaty. They thought they'd given too much away to the British. And members of the House of Representatives want to see documents relating to that treaty, and President Washington says no. He says he doesn't have to give documents to the House because treaties are ratified by the Senate, and he sets a precedent for what we know today as executive privilege, where the President can withhold information on the basis of national security.
President Washington argued that only the Senate approves treaties, so the House of Representatives didn't need the information. He gave the documents to the Senate, but wouldn't share them with the House.
Americans have always been quite suspicious about executive privilege. There's often the idea that politicians and presidents are really trying to cover something up rather than withhold information for national security purposes.
Can executive privilege be used as a way for a president and his staff to get away with breaking the law? Some people worry that it can. In 1974, President Richard M. Nixon was told he had to turn over Oval Office tapes and written records related to a criminal investigation of a break-in at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. But Nixon claimed executive privilege.
The Supreme Court ordered President Nixon to turn over tapes that had been made in the Oval Office, tapes that many people thought would explain to Americans what really happened at Watergate. President Nixon had initially refused to turn over the tapes and some other material. The court instructed him to do it. A few weeks later, he turned over the material, and soon after, he resigns from the presidency.
Is executive privilege even necessary? Recent presidents have used it to prevent their top advisors from testifying before Congress during a number of very controversial events. In addition to Nixon using it during Watergate, Ronald Reagan invoked executive privilege during the Iran-Contra scandal, and Bill Clinton claimed it during the Lewinsky scandal. In the middle of an inquiry conducted by the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States on September 11th, George W. Bush prevented the National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice from testifying, claiming executive privilege. What do presidents have to hide anyway? Of course, all presidents are concerned about releasing information that might put our national security at risk. But George Washington might also have argued that executive privilege upholds a very important idea written right into the Constitution. Separation of powers was designed to prevent too much power from being concentrated in any one branch of government, the presidency, Congress, or judicial arm. A president who openly shares every decision would take away from the system of checks and balances.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The guidelines for executive privilege and how it's interpreted today go back to the days of Watergate. In 1974, the Supreme Court decided that although presidents have a right to quote confidential presidential communications, if these communications are needed for a potential criminal trial, they have to be handed over.
President Clinton invoked executive privilege 4 times, and President Reagan had done so about 3 times. Executive privilege becomes an area of controversy during the Clinton years. When Kenneth Starr, the independent prosecutor, is investigating President Clinton, he claims that the president is withholding information that he has to turn over about this investigation into his affair with an intern.
Independent prosecutor Kenneth Starr argued that the very fact that President Clinton claimed executive privilege in this instance was an abuse of power. So, exactly when is executive privilege okay to use, and who can claim it? That's not always clear. During the Clinton administration, First Lady Hillary Clinton argued that she was covered by executive privilege during the Whitewater real estate scandal. The courts rejected her claim.
In 2002, Vice President Cheney argued that the vice president could withhold information on the basis of executive privilege. Democrats wanted information about a secret group he had convened to write the oil laws of the nation involving energy, and Cheney said that he didn't have to turn that over, that this was secret information, and this became an area of contention.
The Supreme Court ended up refusing to order the vice president to turn over his secret records, but they kept the case alive by sending it back to the lower courts. It's not clear how court decisions on future executive privilege cases will go. What is apparent is that the debate over executive privilege and the power of the presidency isn't going to end anytime soon.
Executive privilege has become an area of controversy since Watergate because it's become a symbol of presidential power. So often when we're fighting about a specific case or moment of executive privilege, did a president have the right to withhold information or not, it's not just a debate about that president, it's a debate about the presidency. How much power should the president have in the United States, and what obligations does the president have to Congress, to the courts, and to citizens?
The idea that government should be transparent, meaning citizens are able to ask and get answers about how specific decisions are made, is one that really defines our country. That's what freedom of the press is all about too. We want to be able to ask questions and get straight answers from our leaders about what they're doing. But few would argue that there are times when opening up the Oval Office puts security at risk. President George W. Bush invoked executive privilege for the first time in his administration to block a congressional committee. It was trying to review documents about a decades-long scandal involving the FBI and its misuse of mob informants. Though it was an old case, would turning over these documents somehow have put FBI agents or these informants at risk? That's a valid question. Still, the President of the United States is rightly seen as the most powerful person in the world. The Founding Fathers felt it was critical we never forget that even the most powerful among us must be held accountable for their actions.